Hey fellow watchers of the multiverse, welcome to another special Halloween edition of What If, where we dive into the darkest corners of the Marvel Universe. Today's spooky tale explores, what if the Amazing Spider-Man became the Man-Spider? That's right. Imagine a world where Peter Parker's spider powers go horribly wrong, and instead of becoming a hero, he mutates into a terrifying, monstrous creature roaming the streets of New York. We'll break down the chilling transformation of Peter Parker, how this would affect his relationship with Gwen Stacy, Aunt May, and even Captain Stacy and the Lizard. What would happen if the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, or the Amazing Spider-Man, became a nightmare? Trust me, this what if is something that you don't want to miss. And of course, I want to hear from you. What other Halloween-themed what if scenarios do you want to see as we continue the Halloween marathon throughout September and October? Whether it's Marvel, whether it's DC, Star Wars, anything in between, drop your requests in the comments down below and I'll make sure to add to them. And plus, we got a ton of content coming soon for you. And more what if fanfictions, rewrites, pre-writes, all these different crossovers, it's all happening here. But before we dive into this haunting story, I want to give a huge shout out to all of you for supporting me on Patreon and on the Substack. If you guys love diving deep into these alternate realities and want to see even more, make sure to check out those exclusive different pieces of content that are on all these different platforms, whether it's on Patreon, here on YouTube, or even on the Substack. You'll get access to exclusive videos, behind the scenes content, insight, everything in between. But that being said, prepare yourself for this creepy and twisted ride. It was a most remarkable and nostalgic day for Peter Parker, bringing in its wake a bucket of old memories. Memories like pleasant evenings with his parents. His mother was bright and bubbly, and would always wear an effervescent smile. His father was curious and disheveled, but would always reciprocate his mother's smile whenever his attention came back to reality. The way he remembered his father, he always seemed to be working. He would gently shift his gaze from the yellowed pages of his jotter to the digital screen before him, completely enamored by the reckonings of his own mind. Too raw to share, but too promising to abandon. His father had a purpose. He was the most hard-working person Peter could think of. Or perhaps his mind simply wanted to remember him that way. Perhaps he wanted to keep him golden and preserve him forever. Peter's mother would look wistfully at her husband, as though she missed him, like lovers gazing longingly at still photos, as they waited patiently for the object of their affection to return. The only problem with that scene was that Peter's father had not ridden off to war, or gone to a distant land in a quest for gold. He was in the same room as his wife, yet she missed him. She could not compete with his purpose, but that did not cause her smile to falter. Although, thinking about it with a mature mind, Peter was not sure that her smile reached her eyes at all. The flashbacks about his family were triggered by the decision he had just formed in his mind. The decision was in turn triggered by the discovery he had just stumbled on. He held in his hands, and as again the proof that his father was a scientist, and not just a regular one. Peter could not comprehend half of the workings on any page, but that did not deter him from flipping through the jotter. He could recall this jotter vividly. It was like his father's favorite accessory. His hands were never bereft of it. Peter felt his hands quiver a little, as the gravity of what he was looking at hit him. He felt tears well up in his eyes. From what Peter could see, the caliber and impact of his father's work set him aside from others. He was decades ahead of his time. His father was an audacious dreamer, but it did not end there. He strove to bridge the gap between what his mind could conjure and what his hands could create. In fact, his father was a huge contributor to some cutting-edge technology that was already in effect. The man had all the makings of a legend. All he lacked was recognition. If he had not passed on when he did, he would have conquered much more. Sadly, he never got credit for his work. But in all of Peter's regret and angst, curiosity overwhelmed every other emotion. He had observed that his father had a partner with which he worked while he was alive. There were pages at a time referring to Dr. Kurt Connors. This meant that Peter had to contact the man wherever he was. It was him Peter was on his way to meet. Every step that brought him closer to Connors' lab felt like a calling. It could have been a premonition, or maybe a prophecy, but Peter sensed that something was about to change. Location: Connors' lab. Time: sometime in the morning. When Peter knocked on the door, Connors had his back to the door. Peter did not know what he was expecting when he imagined Dr. Kurt Connors. The figure that had just turned to face him was not worn out or rickety. He was as fit as a fiddle, and the only sign that he was ahead in age was the silver hair on his head. On the other hand, Connors seemed astonished to see Peter standing there. He took eager steps towards Peter, and before Peter could grasp the situation, the man had enclosed him in a tight hug. It lasted a few seconds before Connors sniffled and released him. It did not take Peter too long to figure out what was going on. Dr. Kurt Connors must have noticed the uncanny resemblance to Peter's father after several years gone by. Peter started a conversation by addressing the same and produced the jotter belonging to his father. It held all his father's lifelong treasures. Connors gasped audibly when his eyes fell on the book. He asked several questions all at once, like how Peter got it, if it truly was the one that belonged to his father, if it was not too badly damaged. After his initial shock had been quelled, and the two men had spent several hours in each other's company, it was eventually possible to have a meaningful conversation. Connors gracefully filled Peter's young ears with stories about his father's old escapades. Eventually, he permitted Peter to take a tour of his lab on the way out, and Peter assured him that he would return the next day for more catching up. Location: a room in Connors' lab. Time: sometime in the afternoon. Peter took zealous steps around creatures, inventions, machines, and contraptions alike. Some of them rang a bell in his mind. Others rattled his mind entirely. He perused and inspected, venturing to do with his eyes what his hands would never dare. He stopped abruptly once he set his thirsty eyes on a most remarkable thing. It was luminescent, and it let out a persistent, soft hum. Peter felt as though he had been enchanted. He drew even closer to it. Something seemed to be moving inside it. Upon closer inspection, there was more than one thing moving in it. The whole thing was crawling with creatures. Peter drew even closer and pressed his forehead against the glass, squinting with his mouth slightly open. Suddenly, he felt a sharp sting on his neck. As his hand flew over to the spot and he strained his eyes to inspect, he noticed something blue from the corner of his eye. By the time he realized what was going on, the creature had disappeared behind the glass tank he stood in front of. Peter thought it looked like a spider. He brushed it off, both the sting in his neck and the scene that had just played out. But that was the end of the tour for the day. Peter walked briskly and did not wait to respond to anything or even anyone. He was close to running, but he had to control himself. He did not want to end up looking like a freak by and by. Being the brunt end of a bad joke was all in a day's work. Occasionally retaliating and getting in trouble was not out of place. But what had just transpired was out of the ordinary. Peter had just overpowered his biggest bully. The boy was in no condition to retaliate, and it was honestly a sheer miracle, perhaps an act of God, that Peter had slipped away before he could get in trouble for it. But all this alone was not reason enough to get Peter as alarmed as he was. It was that, coupled with the recent observations he had made, the entire picture of things was worrisome. He was on his way to Dr. Kurt Connors. he had grown to trust him, and perhaps he would have an idea of what was going on with Peter. Connors was surprised after listening to what Peter had to say. He immediately understood that the little boy had been at the receiving end of one of his inventions. If Peter had brought the issue up a day ago, Connors would have rushed to his aid. But between the time they last met and the current moment, his empathy for Peter had been overtaken by a greater drive. He had just discovered the last piece of the puzzle for one of his inventions in Richard Parker's journal. Connors remembered Richard categorically saying that he did not know how to figure it out, which meant he lied. Then Connors believed every word he said. Now, he simply fumed in anger. He knew how to exact his revenge. Richard's precious boy sat in his lab waiting for him to bring a so-called antidote. Connors chuckled. When he emerged from where he was, he administered some injections to Peter and sent him on his way. When Peter left, Connors knew that things were only about to get worse for Peter. He had just sealed the boy's fate. Location: Peter's house. Time: 2 months after. The days and weeks bled into each other for Peter. It had been weeks since he last stepped outside, but after watching the news last night and seeing that Curt Connors had dared to take the full credit for all his father's treasured work in that jotter, he was determined to make Connors pay, and he was willing to die on that hill. He was larger and hairier, but he concealed that with his clothes. He stormed out of his room and yanked the house door open. He did not intend to be that forceful, but he could not help it. However, he stopped in his tracks when Aunt May called his name. Uncle Ben was with her, and they requested a brief word with him. They began by admitting that they did not know what had been going on with Peter for some time, but that they realized he had been in touch with Curt Connors, and that if Peter's dilemma had anything to do with the man, then he ought to know that he was his father's closest ally. His father held him so dear that before he passed, he was working on completing a special invention for Connors, and that he wanted it to be a surprise. Before they let Peter go, they told him to bear the weight of his father's friendship in mind. He did, and it was so heavy it weighed his former resolve down. Peter took off his cardigan when he came face to face with Connors, whose face registered no shock at the inordinately hairy sight before him. He asked Connors directly if Connors knew the truth about what was happening to him. Connors answered directly to instigate Peter, stating that he did and that it would get progressively worse until Peter became a beast, until he became the man-spider. Peter could sense the caustic tone in Connors' voice, but before he lost his temper, he recalled his family's advice, and the next thing he did shocked him as well. Without warning, he lurched forward to enclose Curt Connors in a hug. However, Connors misread the move and, in the same breath, revealed that he was holding a knife in the hand that was behind his back. It was sudden, and Peter had no time to stop his body from colliding with it. That much was a mistake, but when Connors twisted the knife deeper, it was clear what he was trying to do. Peter's mutant instincts kicked in, and he covered Connors' hand in his and yanked the knife out without wincing. A struggle ensued. Just as Connors was about to thrust the blade into Peter's torso, Peter succeeded in flipping it into Connors' navel. When Peter realized what he had done, he was full of remorse, but he was not fully to blame as he was merely defending himself. Connors sputtered blood and dropped to the ground slowly. It was a quiet death. The moment was surreal, and Peter stood still for a painfully long time. All he could recall were his aunt's words, and how he was determined not to let them down. Sadly, Connors had passed, but Peter was determined not to let Connors' death, or the fate of a beast he had been doomed to, all be for nothing. And he was willing to die on that hill.
And that is going to be it for What If the Amazing Spider-Man Became the Man-Spider.
Now let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of this What If episode, and if you guys are new around here and would like to see more videos, I would highly recommend that you guys click that big red button. Do make sure to subscribe, as it really goes a long way. It pushes this channel even further, as well as smashing the like button. I would highly recommend that you guys do that as well, because it just goes right through the algorithm where everyone can see this channel. I mean, the past couple years have been a little bit rough on the channel, and I was like, how do I spice it up a little bit? And I think doing the Halloween content is just something that has been missing on this channel, as well as just holiday specials in general. So it's really nice to have something fresh for you guys, and I know that you guys have been enjoying it because I've seen a lot of your comments. So it just really means a lot to me. But that being said, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will see you in the next video. Take care and have a wonderful day. Peace out.